Europe in the 1930s saw the rise of a mustachioed fascist supported by a violent uniform-wearing political group who operated as a fantastic speaker with an ability to whip up the masses in support of his far-right ideals. But this video is not about the one you most definitely know about, it's about the one you might only know from allegedly hanging around Birmingham with a group of flat-cap gangsters called the Peaky Blinders. Oswald Mosley was a member of the two biggest political parties in Britain and went on to create his own fascist party around the same time as the other bad moustache man did in Germany. In fact, he was so closely tied to the fascist movements in Europe he based his own movement off of Mussolini's fascist party in Italy and even had Hitler as the guest of honour at his wedding to his second wife. Operating up to World War II and after, Mosley is remembered as one of the most dangerous men in British political history, a man with a liking for big radical ideas and as a man who never fully realised his political career, maybe for the best. Well, make sure to stick around because this short 7-minute documentary will cover all and more. And if you like this video, please subscribe and let me know in the comments if there are any other topics you would like to see me cover. Oswald Mosley was born on the 16th of November 1896 in Westminster. He was the eldest of 3 sons to his father, Sir Oswald Mosley, and his mother, Catherine Maud Edwards Heathcote. His father held the hereditary title of baronet, which was awarded to the family by the British Crown. A young Mosley initially saw a career for himself in the military, but was kicked out 5 months later for riotous acts of retaliation against a fellow student. It has been reported that in his formative years he became somewhat of a bully boy, often getting into fights and tormenting those he could take advantage of. In a twisted act of fate, the First World War broke out and Mosley saw himself commissioned into the military just a month after being kicked out and fought in France on the Western Front. After eventually getting injured and being left with a permanent limp, Mosley spent the remainder of the war completing desk jobs for the British Foreign Office. By the time the war ended, Mosley had already decided to go into politics with a Conservative vacancy in Harrow drawing his attention. Oswald won the seat with no significant opposition in the 1918 election and became the youngest member of the House of Commons, and soon made a reputation for himself as a great orator. Despite Mosley being considered as a fine young gentleman with a bright future in the Conservative Party, he fell out with the party over its policy in Ireland and decided to cross the floor and sit as an independent MP, leaving the Conservative Party. Throughout this time, Mosley became increasingly attracted to the Labour Party and eventually joined them in March of 1924. It's safe to say that Mosley was quite the political opportunist, especially after this move as the Labour Party had just formed a government for the first time under the leadership of Ramsay MacDonald, and probably saw his chance at working his way up the party. Mosley's stint in the Labour Party didn't last long, however. In the October of that same year, MacDonald's government fell and a general election was announced. Mosley decided to run for the Birmingham Ladywood seat instead, standing against the future Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. The two fought a tough campaign and after several recounts Chamberlain was declared the winner by just 77 votes. After being outside Parliament for nearly 2 years, Mosley won a by-election, taking his seat as a member for the Labour Party once again. Ever the opportunist, Mosley made several bids for political advancement within the Labour Party. He put himself close to the leader Ramsay MacDonald and hoped to position himself for one of the great offices of state. But when Labour won the 1929 election, he was only given a lesser position. Disappointed with his role and that none of his radical proposals put forward to solve the economic crisis were taken on board, Mosley resigned from his position nearly a year later and grew increasingly dissatisfied with the party as a whole, deciding to form his own party, aptly named the New Party. Mosley's New Party was initially well received politically among both sides due to its economic policies, and Mosley even featured on the cover of Time magazine in 1931. And we all know who else has appeared on that front cover. Mosley's New Party began increasingly leaning into fascist policies, and after suffering an election failure in 1931, Mosley began a tour studying rising fascist movements across Europe. After being particularly inspired by Benito Mussolini's new movement in Italy, he returned to Britain to set up the British Union of Fascists, a new party that promoted an anti-communist, nationalist and authoritarian agenda. The party proved initially popular, with it boasting a membership of 50,000 members at its height and found support in the British tabloids. Despite this initial limited success, Mosley did find some opposition among the British public. His rallies and party meetings were frequently disrupted by the public, which led to Mosley creating a group of paramilitary stewards named the blackshirts, like the fascist Italian militia they were trying to imitate. The blackshirts' attraction to violence would eventually sow Mosley's downfall, as they became involved in several violent confrontations with communist and Jewish groups in London, and even began inciting riots. It was around this time he supposedly met up with that group of flat-cap gangsters in Birmingham, but we'll save that for the TV show. At an especially large rally at Olympia in London in 1934, the violence from the blackshirts created particularly bad publicity for the party, coupled with the Night of the Long Knives in Germany, saw Mosley's fascist party lose its support from the British tabloids. Despite the negative reception Mosley was receiving, he leant further into the same fascist and nationalist rhetoric that was being spread through Germany and Italy as well. He began organising marches with his blackshirts through areas with a high proportion of Jewish residents, which often resulted in violence such as the infamous Battle of Cable Street. Mosley had become such a danger, and probably much to do with worries of his movement catching on, the government introduced a bill banning political uniforms and military-style organisations, which came into effect in 1937. This severely limited Mosley's reach and made him vulnerable when making public appearances, with him being knocked unconscious by a crowd in Liverpool. Despite the violence, despite the public attacks, and despite the impending war in Europe, Mosley and his party did remain somewhat popular, with him being able to pull in a crowd of around 30,000 at a rally in 1939, which is still one of the largest political rallies in British history. However, once Britain decided to fight against fascism in Europe and the resulting aerial bombardment known as the Blitz, support for Mosley finally evaporated. Unbeknown to Mosley, the British Secret Service had infiltrated his party and had been monitoring him since 1934, with it being feared that his great skill as an orator would allow him to convince the British public to support the British Union of Fascists. The Secret Service were happy trying to negate his impact, but after he called for a negotiated peace with Germany, Mosley was considered too dangerous and was detained just a fortnight after Winston Churchill became Prime Minister and his party was disbanded. Despite never being charged for a crime, Mosley was kept in detainment until 1943, when he was allowed to live under house arrest until the end of the war. However, that wasn't the end of Mosley, as after the war his former supporters talked him into returning to politics. This saw him create another new party called the Union Movement. But Britain had yet to forgive his fascist leanings, and his party's meetings were frequently disrupted, just as they were before the war. After his failure to gain a following, Mosley left Britain for Ireland. Although it was clear his political career was over, it didn't stop Mosley from returning to Britain several times to run for office, often running on an anti-immigration platform and calling for the prohibition of mixed marriages. All in all, proving that he was still not that much of a nice chap. Despite his obvious far-right beliefs, he still claimed he was a man of the left, and probably still believed there was a silent majority in the country that supported him, which from his poor performance in elections and the British public's distaste for anything resembling what they just fought in World War II, showed he was misplaced in that belief. Mosley died in 1980 after suffering from Parkinson's disease and was given a quiet funeral. Ultimately, Mosley was a man who was a great speaker, someone who could easily whip up a crowd, and a man of radical ideas. But he was also a man who would most likely have never been made Prime Minister even if he stuck to one of the major parties. He never had the mass appeal across the country that was needed, and it was quite clear that despite him having a loyal group of violent followers, most people were against his fascist ideals. His story remains with us as a stark reminder of what Britain could have become and what it could still turn into. If you enjoyed my video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel where I'll be making more content like this. I really appreciate you watching and look forward to seeing you again next time.